In this video, we'll talk about all the executions carried out in the United States between 1977 and 1984, following the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. We'll explore their crimes, their last meals, their final words, and the details of their executions. Welcome to Criminal Records. Gary Gilmore, State, Utah. On the night of July 19, 1976, Gary Gilmore robbed and murdered Max Jensen, a gas station attendant in Orem, Utah. The following night, he killed Benny Bushnell, a motel manager in Provo. Both victims followed his orders, yet were still executed with a shot to the head. Gilmore was quickly captured after accidentally shooting himself in the hand while disposing of the weapon. His cousin, Brenda Nicole, reported him shortly after he called her asking for bandages and painkillers for the wound. Utah State Police arrested him as he was trying to leave Provo by car. He did not resist arrest. Although he was charged with both murders, the case involving Max Jensen never went to trial due to an apparent lack of eyewitnesses. During the trial for Bushnell's murder, Gilmore gained notoriety for demanding his own execution. The Supreme Court had recently reinstated the death penalty in 1976 with the Gregg v. Georgia decision. Gilmore refused to appeal his sentence and made no effort to avoid execution, drawing national attention. He was sentenced to death for his crimes. The day before his execution, he was offered a last meal. He chose baked potatoes, 2 hamburgers, hard-boiled eggs, coffee, and liquor. On January 17, 1977, at 8:07 a.m., Gary Gilmore was executed by firing squad at the Utah State Prison. He was strapped to a chair, and 5 law enforcement officers fired at his chest. When asked for his final words, he simply said, "Let's do it." Gilmore had requested that some of his organs be donated for transplants. Hours after his execution, 2 people received his corneas. His body was autopsied, cremated that same day, and his ashes were scattered over Spanish Fork, Utah. John Spenkelink, State, Florida. John Spenkelink was the first man executed in Florida after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. His case became a symbol of the national debate over the fairness of the criminal justice system. Spenkelink, who had served time for armed robbery in California, escaped from prison in 1972. A year later, in 1973, he shot and killed Joseph Szymankiewicz, a 45-year-old drifter, in a motel room in Tallahassee, Florida. He claimed self-defense, saying the victim had sexually assaulted him, forced him to play Russian roulette, and stolen his money. However, according to a co-defendant's testimony, Spenkelink left the room, returned with a gun, and shot Szymankiewicz in the back. He rejected a plea deal that would have given him life in prison and was tried for first-degree murder. In 1976, he was sentenced to death. His co-defendant was released. In the following years, his execution was postponed multiple times due to legal appeals. Finally, in 1979, Governor Bob Graham signed the final death warrant. Unlike Gary Gilmore, Spenkelink did not want to die. He became the first person in the U.S. to be executed against his will since the return of capital punishment. The night before his execution, he shared a bottle of Jack Daniels with the prison superintendent, a suggestion that, interestingly, came from the superintendent himself. On the morning of May 25, 1979, at 10:12 a.m., Spenkelink was executed in the electric chair. His body jolted through 3 successive surges. Some witnesses claimed that before the hood was placed over his head, his eyes showed a deep, raw terror. At that moment, Reverend Tom Feimster gave him communion. Spenkelink's final words were, "Man is what he chooses to be. He chooses it himself. I love you." To which the Reverend replied, "I love you too." Spenkelink often signed his prison letters with a phrase that summed up his view of the justice system. Capital punishment means those without capital get the punishment. Stephen Timothy Judy, State, Indiana. Stephen Timothy Judy was a serial killer and rapist with a long history of violence whose public execution shocked the state of Indiana. Judy, a former construction worker from Indianapolis, committed one of the country's most brutal crimes on April 28, 1979. Judy flagged her down, pretending to be a good Samaritan. He told her something was wrong with her tire and offered to help. In reality, he had sabotaged the car and then offered to give them a ride. He drove them to a remote area near White Lick Creek. There, Judy forced the children to walk down a trail while he attacked Chastine. He raped her, tied her hands and feet, and began to strangle her. When she screamed, her children came running back, only to witness the horrific scene. Later that day, police found the bodies of Chastine and her 3 children, Misty, Stephen, and Mark. Chastine had been strangled, and the children had been drowned. In the week leading up to his execution, Judy confessed to his adoptive mother that he had committed other murders in various states. He claimed to have killed more women than he could remember. His confessions included 2 murders in Louisiana in 1973, the killing of a dance instructor named Linda Unverzagt in Indianapolis in 1978, and other victims whose fates remain unknown. Judy said he had left them tied up or dumped in remote locations. During his trial, Judy pleaded guilty to the murders of Chastine and her children. He rejected an insanity defense and demanded the death penalty. He told the judge directly, "I really want you to give me the death penalty, because someday, somehow, I might get out of that prison, and I think I've already proven that." On February 25, 1980, he was sentenced to death. The execution took place on March 9, 1981, at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. It was the first execution in the state since 1961. His last meal included prime ribs, lobster tails, baked potatoes with sour cream, a chef's salad with French dressing, and a dinner roll. He also requested 4 beers, but the request was denied. The only witnesses to his execution were state officials, his adoptive father Robert Carr, and his attorney Stephen L. Harris. His final words were, "I hold no grudges. This is my doing. I'm sorry it happened." Frank Coppola. State, Virginia. Frank Coppola was a former police officer from Portsmouth, Virginia, whose life took a dark turn into violence and crime. He was fired from the department for filing a false report and failing to report an assault on an inmate. Although he was reinstated after a suspension, he was suspended again for insubordination and eventually resigned in 1967. Years later, following a car accident in 1975 that caused chronic pain and contributed to the collapse of his second marriage, Coppola spiraled into financial trouble. In 1978, along with his wife Karen, former accomplice Joseph Miltier, and Miltier's girlfriend Donna Mills, he planned a robbery at the home of Peyton M. Hatchell, a wealthy used car dealer in Newport News, Virginia. The first robbery attempt failed. But on April 22, 1978, Donna Mills arrived at the Hatchell's home pretending to be a delivery person, hiding a gun in a bouquet of roses. Once inside, she, Coppola, and Miltier brutally beat Muriel Hatchell while demanding to know where the money was. According to trial testimony, Coppola was the one who repeatedly slammed Muriel's head into the floor. During the attack, Mr. Hatchell came home and was also severely beaten. The attackers fled with 3 rings and $3,000 in cash. Muriel later died from a brain hemorrhage caused by the beating, while Peyton survived, but with permanent injuries. Coppola was caught, and despite denying involvement, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found in Hatchell's car, and Mills testified against him. On September 26, 1978, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The other accomplices received heavy sentences. Miltier was sentenced to 3 life terms. Mills to life plus 117 years, and Karen Coppola to 55 years in prison. In 1982, Coppola chose to drop all appeals. He said he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison and wanted to spare his family further suffering. He even said he would flip the switch himself when the time came. A day before his execution, his last meal was an egg and cheese sandwich. He was executed in the electric chair on August 10, 1982, at 11:27 p.m. at the Virginia State Penitentiary. His execution was controversial. According to his attorney, the first jolt wasn't enough, and the second caused the electrodes to catch fire, filling the room with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. His final words were directed to an activist who had supported him through the process. "I love you. Please take care of my family, my children." Charles Brooks, State, Texas. Charles Brooks had already served time for illegal possession of firearms when, on December 14, 1976, he committed the crime that would land him on death row. That day, he visited a used car lot and asked to test drive one of the vehicles. The mechanic on duty, David Gregory, accompanied him. After picking up his accomplice, Woody Ludras, the two men kidnapped Gregory, forced him into the trunk of the car, and drove him to a motel. There, they tied him to a chair, taped his mouth shut, and shot him in the head. It was never definitively established who pulled the trigger. Neither Brooks nor Ludras admitted to firing the gun. However, Ludras testified against Brooks in exchange for a 40-year sentence. Charles Brooks was sentenced to death. Despite lingering doubts about his direct role in the murder, even the prosecutor in the case asked for a commutation, the execution was approved. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 2-1 to proceed, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied a stay by a vote of 6-3. On December 6, 1982, the day before his execution, Brooks requested his last meal: a T-bone steak, French fries, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, cookies, peach cobbler, and iced tea. He had originally requested fried shrimp and oysters, but the prison chef informed him that seafood was not allowed. On December 7, 1982, Charles Brooks was executed at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was the first person in the United States to be executed by lethal injection. His final words were a verse from the Quran, spoken in Arabic: "Alhamdulillah, Rabb al-Alamin, al-Rahman al-Rahim, Malik Yawm al-Din." John Evans, State, Alabama. In 1976, John Evans was granted parole in Indiana. Shortly afterward, along with his partner Wayne Ritter, he launched a violent crime spree that lasted 2 months and spanned 7 states. Evans confessed to committing more than 30 armed robberies, 9 kidnappings, and 2 attempted extortions. On January 5, 1977, the two robbed a pawn shop in Mobile, Alabama, and murdered the owner, Edward Nassar, while his young daughters were in the store. They shot him in the back before fleeing. The FBI captured them on March 7th in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were found in possession of the murder weapon and another stolen handgun. Evans offered a detailed confession, but prosecutors refused to accept it because they wanted a jury conviction and death sentence, as required by Alabama law. During the trial, Evans showed no remorse. He admitted to his crime and even threatened the jury, stating that if they didn't sentence him to death, he would escape and kill them all. The jury deliberated for only 15 minutes before finding him guilty and sentencing him to death. The sentence was reviewed and upheld by higher courts. His mother attempted to appeal as a next friend, but her request was denied. In 1982, Evans dismissed his attorneys and waived all remaining appeals. He was executed on April 22, 1983, by electric chair at Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama. The chair, nicknamed Yellow Mama, had been built by an inmate in 1927 and had not been used since 1965. At 8:40 p.m., the executioner flipped the switch for the third time. Evans was pronounced dead at 8:44 p.m., after a grueling 14-minute ordeal in which he was essentially burned alive. His last meal consisted of steak, shrimp, and French fries. However, one of his final requests was not honored, though the details were never disclosed. Before his death, Evans attempted to say a few words. He said, "I hold no grudges against anyone. I hate no one. Jimmy Lee Gray, State, Mississippi." In 1968, Jimmy Lee Gray, at the age of 19, was convicted for the horrific crime of taking the life of his 16-year-old girlfriend, Elda Louise Prince, in Arizona. He brutally attacked her and left her body in a railway canal. He was sentenced to between 20 years and life imprisonment, but was released in 1975 after serving only 7 years. A year later, in Mississippi, he committed another devastating crime. He was found guilty of taking the life of a 3-year-old girl, Duressa Jean Scales, who used to play with his cats. He took her to a wooded area where the tragic crime occurred. He confessed to everything during the police interrogation. He was sentenced to death in December 1976. Although initially the Mississippi Supreme Court ordered a retrial, the sentence was reinstated in 1978. His own mother, deeply affected, wrote to the governor and the court, asking for no further opportunities to be given. On September 2, 1983, Gray was executed in Mississippi's gas chamber, becoming the first person executed in the state since 1964. His last meal was substantial: burritos, enchiladas, rice, beans, salad, strawberries, milk, and a pizza, which he shared with a group of ministers before receiving communion. His execution was especially controversial. The chamber had no head support, causing Gray to violently hit his head against a metal tube while suffering spasms. Witnesses heard at least 11 groans before the room was evacuated, with Gray still alive. Later, his lawyer stated that the evacuation of the room was to prevent witnesses from seeing the cruelty of the procedure. It was later revealed that the executioner was under the influence of alcohol. Robert Austin Sullivan, State, Florida. On the night of April 8, 1973, Robert Austin Sullivan and his accomplice, Reed McLaughlin, went to the Howard Johnson's restaurant in Homestead, Florida, where Sullivan had worked as an assistant manager. There, they kidnapped 38-year-old Donald Schmidt, the new assistant manager. They tied his hands with tape, took him to a swamp in the Everglades, beat him with a crowbar, and shot him 4 times in the neck with a 12-gauge shotgun. They then stole his credit cards and watch. Sullivan was arrested on April 17th, and the police found the shotgun, pistol, crowbar, tape, and stolen items in his car. He confessed to the crime and implicated McLaughlin, who also confessed and agreed to a life sentence in exchange for testifying against Sullivan. Years later, Sullivan denied his guilt, claiming he had confessed while intoxicated and that his confession was coerced. He also alleged that his lawyer had not called witnesses who could confirm his alibi, that he was at a gay bar at the time of the crime. Sullivan claimed that the motive for the robbery was to pay off a blackmailer threatening to reveal his sexual orientation to his father. He was found guilty and sentenced to death on November 12, 1973. During his time on death row, he was described as a model prisoner. His execution was postponed several times until finally, on November 30, 1983, he was executed in the electric chair at the age of 36. He was the second person executed in Florida since 1976. His last meal consisted of steak, French fries, milk, and fresh strawberries. Before his death, he read a 2-page statement with several pauses due to emotion. His final words were addressed to his fellow death row inmates. "Despite what is about to happen to me, don't give up. I hold no grudges against anyone. May God bless us all." Robert Wayne Williams, State, Louisiana. On January 5, 1979, Robert Wayne Williams and his accomplice, Ralph Holmes, robbed an A&P supermarket in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Both wore ski masks, and Williams carried a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun. They approached the 67-year-old security guard, Willie Kelly, who was packing groceries. When Holmes tried to take Kelly's weapon, Kelly made a move with his hand. Williams shouted, "Don't even try it," and shot Kelly in the face at point-blank range. They then completed the robbery. During the assault, Holmes struck a customer, and Williams accidentally shot 2 people in their feet. The police received an anonymous tip implicating Williams, his wife, and Holmes. All were arrested, and both Williams and his wife confessed to the crime. Williams was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death on May 30, 1979. Holmes received a life sentence. Although Williams maintained that the shooting was accidental and did not testify at his trial, the verdict stood. The police chief criticized the security company for failing to properly train Kelly, who had not even been trained for the position. On December 14, 1983, Williams was executed in the electric chair at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, being declared dead at 1:15 a.m. He refused his last meal. He became the first person executed in Louisiana since 1961, and the first after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. He was also the second black person executed in the United States since that date, and the first for killing a black victim. His last words were, "I told the truth about what happened. I'd like this to be remembered in Louisiana and across the country as a warning against the death penalty. Let them see that it doesn't work, and it never has. To those who fight against the death penalty, keep fighting, not just for me, but for everyone." John Eldon Smith, State, Georgia. On August 31, 1974, John Eldon Smith, his wife Rebecca Turpin, and an accomplice named John Marie conspired to murder Ronald Akins and his new wife, Juanita. Rebecca, Ronald's ex-wife, planned to collect a $53,000 life insurance payout after his death. Smith and Marie lured the couple to a construction site in Bibb County, Georgia, under the pretense of installing a television antenna. When Ronald and Juanita arrived, both were ambushed and shot with a shotgun while still in their car. Rebecca was not present at the crime scene as she was in Miami at the time. The bodies were discovered hours later by a pilot flying over the area. After an investigation, all 3 involved were arrested in October 1974. Marie cooperated with authorities, testifying that the original plan was to drug Ronald, but when Juanita accompanied him, they decided to kill both of them instead. In exchange for his testimony, Marie received 2 life sentences. John Eldon Smith was convicted after a 3-day trial. Rebecca was also sentenced to death but later received a new trial, claiming underrepresentation of women on the jury. She was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Smith was the first person in Georgia to be sentenced to death with a scheduled execution date following the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, making his case high profile. Despite protests from public figures, such as Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson, Smith was executed. On December 15, 1983, John Eldon Smith was executed in the electric chair. He became the first person to be executed in Georgia since 1964. His official time of death was 8:15 a.m. Although rumors later suggested his last words were, "Well, the Lord is going to bring another one." Contemporary sources indicate that no official statement was made. However, before being strapped into the electric chair, he told the guards, "Hey, there's no need to tighten it so much." Anthony Antone, State, Florida. Anthony Antone was an American convicted of orchestrating the murder of private investigator Richard Cloud. The crime occurred on October 23, 1975, under the orders of crime boss Victor Acosta. Antone was arrested and sentenced to death on August 27, 1976. He spent 7 years and 10 months on Florida's death row. His execution became controversial, as at 66 years old, he was the oldest person on Florida's death row. The Florida Catholic Conference, among others, joined in a campaign to have his death sentence commuted. Although his execution was delayed on January 14, 1984, Governor Bob Graham denied clemency requests. Finally, Anthony Antone was executed in the electric chair on January 26, 1984, making him the oldest person to be executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated. He held this record until 2004, when James Hubbard in Alabama surpassed him. Before his execution, visibly distressed, he said, "I'm very upset. I don't know what to say, really. How much time do I have? I want to apologize to my parents. I feel remorse for the 2 boys I killed, but it's hard to show it." John Albert Taylor, State, Utah. On June 23, 1989, in Washington Terrace, Utah, Sharon King returned home and faced one of the most devastating scenes a human being can encounter. She found her 11-year-old daughter, Sharla, without vital signs. The crime was brutal. The young girl had been attacked in her own bedroom in what, according to the prosecution, was a premeditated act with deeply disturbing intent. John Albert Taylor, a man with a criminal history who had arrived from Florida just days before the murder, was identified as the prime suspect. His own sister alerted authorities after learning details that implicated him. Taylor's fingerprints matched those found at the scene, and witnesses placed him at the apartment at the time of the crime. Despite his attempts to claim he had only entered to rob, the physical, forensic, and testimonial evidence contradicted him. The trial began in November 1989. Taylor waived his right to a jury, and on December 5th of that year he was found guilty of murder and other serious crimes. During the sentencing phase, details of his difficult childhood and time in mental institutions were presented, but the judge concluded that the crime outweighed any mitigating factors. He was sentenced to death. The night before his execution, Taylor requested a large, abundant meal, a large ambassador pizza with thin crust, topped with onions, mushrooms, spicy peppers, sausage, pepperoni, ham, and extra cheese. He accompanied it with a Coca-Cola. The meal was shared with his uncle, his former lawyer, and a priest who spent his last night with him. Taylor, nervous, requested antacids that night and refused more food when offered. In a symbolic gesture, he handed his glasses to the prison director before being escorted to the execution chamber, saying, "There's no need for them." Taylor chose to die by firing squad, becoming the first inmate to be executed by this method in the United States since 1977. He declined sedation. At 12:03 a.m. on January 26, 1996, 5 volunteer officers fired. 4 bullets were real, and 1 was made of wax, so no shooter would know which one fired the lethal shot. Taylor was declared dead at 12:07 a.m. His final words before being executed were, "I would like to tell my family and my friends, as the poem goes, remember me, but let me go." James David Autry, State, Texas. From a young age, James David Autry lived a life marked by abuse and violence. According to his own testimony, his father frequently beat him, and by the age of 13, he began having problems with the law. In prison, he was known as Cowboy, a nickname that reflected both his defiant attitude and impulsive, remorseless character. On the night of April 20th, 1980, Autry entered a sack and pack store in Port Arthur, Texas, intending to steal a 6-pack of beer. Shirley Drouet, the 43-year-old cashier and mother of 5, confronted him and demanded he pay. Autry pulled out a .38 caliber pistol and shot her in the forehead. He left the store, but returned minutes later. Inside, he found 2 customers checking Shirley's body, Joseph Broussard, a 43-year-old former Catholic priest, and Athanasios Sfarnas, a 30-year-old Greek merchant sailor. Fearing they could identify him, he shot them as well. The police arrived shortly after receiving a shooting report. Sfarnas was found gravely wounded in the parking lot, while Broussard was dead inside the store, with gunshot wounds to the head and neck. Drouet was still breathing, but died on the way to the hospital. No money or personal belongings were stolen, only a $2.76 pack of beer. Autry was arrested a few hours later at the mobile home he shared with his friend John Sandifer. Though he tried to blame Sandifer, he was recorded while talking to his mother from the police station, confessing he had attempted to rob the store and that things had gotten out of control. He was sentenced to death for these crimes and never appealed his sentence. The day before his execution, he requested a hamburger, fries, and a Dr. Pepper as his last meal. On October 4th, 1983, he was strapped to the gurney with the needles already inserted when a last-minute stay was granted, but this only delayed the inevitable. He was finally executed by lethal injection on March 14, 1984, becoming the second person executed in Texas after the reinstatement of the death penalty. He did not say a single word before dying. During his time on death row, he expressed a preference for being hanged or decapitated, as he believed lethal injection wasn't manly. He also requested that his execution be televised so the public could see the reality of the death penalty. This request was denied. James William Hutchins, State, North Carolina. James William Hutchins was an American murderer convicted of killing 3 law enforcement officers in North Carolina in 1979. He was also implicated in a 1954 homicide in New Mexico and was suspected in a 3rd state. On May 31, 1979, Hutchins assaulted his teenage daughter during a domestic dispute in Rutherford. When officers Roy Husky and Owen Messersmith arrived, Hutchins shot and killed them both with a rifle from inside his home. He then fled in his car, armed. Due to failures in the sheriff's dispatch system, no alert was issued in time. Later, State Patrol Officer Robert Pete Peterson initiated a pursuit after spotting Hutchins' car speeding, unaware of the earlier murders. When Peterson stopped him, Hutchins murdered him as well. Hutchins was captured on June 1, 1979, after an intense search involving more than 200 local, state, and federal agents. He was tried and sentenced to death. His execution was delayed by several appeals, including one challenging the exclusion of jurors opposed to the death penalty. The U.S. Supreme Court narrowly rejected his appeal by a 5-4 vote, drawing strong criticism for the speed of the decision. He was eventually executed by lethal injection in North Carolina on March 16, 1984. His last meal was a meat sandwich and a soft drink. He did not make any final statement. The case led to reforms in communication protocols between state law enforcement agencies. Ronald Clark O'Brien, State, Texas. Ronald Clark O'Brien was an American murderer initially known as the Pixie Sticks Killer and later dubbed Candyman. On October 31, 1974, in Pasadena, Texas, O'Brien poisoned his 8-year-old son Timothy with a candy laced with cyanide, a giant tube of pixie sticks, in order to collect a $20,000 life insurance payout. That Halloween, despite the rain, O'Brien took his children out to trick-or-treat. Upon returning home, he allowed Timothy to choose a candy and helped him open it. He even gave him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash it down. Timothy began vomiting and convulsing almost immediately, and he died within an hour. O'Brien also handed out poisoned candy to other children in an attempt to cover up the murder. However, none of the other children ate the candy. Investigators found that O'Brien was in significant financial debt and had purchased several life insurance policies for his children, including one for $31,000 just days before the crime. During the trial, his premeditated plan and his sole motive money from the insurance became evident. He was convicted and sentenced to death. The day before his execution, his last meal consisted of a medium-rare beef steak, French fries with ketchup, corn on the cob, sweet peas, lettuce and tomato salad with egg and French dressing, iced tea, sweetener, crackers, Boston cream pie, and rolls. On March 31, 1984, O'Brien was executed by lethal injection. His last words were, "What is about to happen in a few moments is wrong." However, we as human beings make mistakes, and this execution is one of those mistakes. But that doesn't mean our entire justice system is wrong. Therefore, I will forgive everyone who has had any part in my death. I will also pray and ask for forgiveness for everyone I've offended in any way during my 39 years of life, just as I will do for anyone who has offended me. I will pray and ask God for mercy and forgiveness for all men. To my loved ones, I extend my immortal love. To my close ones, know in your hearts that I love each and every one of you. God bless you all, and may God's best wishes always be with you. Elmo Patrick Saunier, State, Louisiana. On November 4th of that year, David LeBlanc and Loretta Ann Bourque were at a remote location in St. Martin Parish after a school football game. Around 1 a.m., the Saunier brothers, Elmo Patrick Saunier, 27, and Eddie James Saunier, 20, approached them armed with Sambonu caliber rifles, pretending to be police officers. With a fake badge, they told the young couple they were being arrested for trespassing. They handcuffed both victims, put them in a car, and drove them to an oil site. There, Elmo raped Loretta, and then, under the promise of letting them go if she complied, she was also forced to have sex with Eddie. Despite the promises, the brothers decided to kill them to prevent them from reporting the crime. They made them lie face down in a ditch and shot them multiple times. They attempted to cover up the evidence by burying the guns and getting rid of the victims' driver's licenses. A car Jack found in Elmo's vehicle was crucial in linking them to the crime. Elmo confessed multiple times, including during his transfer to prison. Handcuffs found in his room matched those used in the crime. Both brothers were convicted of first-degree murder in 1978. Initially sentenced to death, the conviction was overturned due to procedural errors. In a second trial, Eddie attempted to take full responsibility, but the state reaffirmed that Elmo was the main perpetrator. Eddie was sentenced to life in prison without parole because he was a minor at the time of the crime. Elmo's execution was scheduled for April 5, 1984. The night before, his lawyer appealed to the Supreme Court based on an alleged confession by Eddie to a former cellmate, but it was rejected. Sister Helen Prejean, who had been his spiritual advisor, was with him in his final hours, as were the parents of the victims. His last meal was a steak. In the execution chamber, Elmo addressed David LeBlanc's father with his last words. "I understand how you feel. I have no hatred in my heart. As I leave this world, I ask God to forgive me for what I did. I also ask you to forgive me for what I did." He was executed in the electric chair, known as Gertie Horripilante, and was declared dead at 12:15 a.m. on April 5, 1984. Eddie James Saunier died in prison in December 2013 at the age of 57. Arthur Frederick, State, Florida. Arthur Good was a criminal convicted of a series of serious offenses involving minors, culminating in his death sentence in Florida. From a young age, Good displayed troubling behaviors. He was arrested several times for incidents involving minors, but managed to avoid severe consequences due to his parents' intervention. In 1975, he was sentenced to probation and psychological treatment in Baltimore, but left the treatment within days and moved to Florida. On March 5, 1976, he committed the crime that would lead him to death row. In Cape Coral, he encountered a minor with whom he engaged in a criminal act that ended with the child's death. He then traveled to other states where he interacted with more minors, resulting in another homicide. He was captured shortly thereafter when someone recognized one of the children with him and alerted authorities. Good was first tried in Maryland, where he was found competent and guilty, receiving a life sentence. He was then transferred to Florida, where he was allowed to represent himself during the trial for the crime committed in that state. On March 21, 1977, he was sentenced to death. Throughout his incarceration, Good exhibited erratic and concerning behavior. He wrote inappropriate letters, made offensive comments, and showed no genuine remorse. His case sparked public outrage. For his last meal, he requested steak with vegetables and cookies. He was executed by electrocution on April 5, 1984. His last words were, "I feel remorse for the 2 kids I killed, but it's hard for me to show it." James Adams, State, Florida. James Adams was executed in Florida in 1984 after being convicted for the murder of a wealthy rancher in 1973. His case sparked controversy and deep debate regarding the possible influence of racial factors in the application of the death penalty. Adams, an African-American man, always maintained his innocence and argued that his conviction was tainted by racial bias. Although there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, some of the victims' belongings were found in a car driven by Adams. A witness also claimed to have seen him leaving the victim's house shortly after the supposed time of the murder. Hours before his execution, an appeals court had granted a stay to review whether Florida's death penalty laws were being applied discriminatorily. However, the U.S. Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, overturned the stay, allowing the execution to proceed. Adams was executed by electrocution and was pronounced dead at 7:11 a.m. on May 20, 1984. He was 47 years old. Before his execution, Adams delivered a final message. "To all men sentenced to death, keep fighting because it's wrong and immoral. I have no animosity toward anyone. I only have love." Carl Schreiner, State, Florida. Carl Schreiner was executed in the electric chair on June 20, 1984, for his involvement in a violent robbery at a store in Gainesville, Florida, in 1976, during which a female employee was killed. Schreiner had spent much of his life in correctional institutions from a very young age. Just before the crime, he had been released from prison after serving a sentence for theft. During the trial, the prosecution argued that he was the author of the assault and directly responsible for the victim's death. Schreiner was executed at Florida State Prison, becoming the 6th inmate to be executed in the state since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Yvonne Ray Stanley, State, Georgia. Yvonne Ray Stanley was sentenced to death for his involvement in the murder of Clifford Floyd, which occurred on April 12, 1976, in DeKalb County, Georgia. The crime, committed alongside an accomplice named Herman F. Cook, involved a robbery that tragically escalated. According to case records, Floyd, a 56-year-old insurance collector, was approached during his workday. Stanley and Cook shot him and then left him in a remote area. The specific circumstances of the crime shocked the local community. Stanley was arrested just 2 days later, on April 14, 1976. The evidence found and witness statements were pivotal in his capture. His accomplice was also arrested and faced a separate trial. During the trial, Stanley's defense team presented arguments related to his mental health and personal history, asking that these factors be taken into account in sentencing. However, the jury found him guilty of aggravated murder, and in 1977 he was sentenced to death. Over the years, Stanley filed multiple appeals, citing procedural errors and questioning the proportionality of his sentence. Despite these efforts, his conviction was upheld in several judicial rulings. On July 12, 1984, Ivan Ray Stanley was executed at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. He was 28 years old at the time of his execution. In his final statement, he briefly expressed regret, though his words were received with mixed interpretations. Stanley's case left a mark on Georgia's legal history, not only because of the nature of the crime, but also because it was one of the few executions recorded on audio, which sparked a debate about transparency and ethics in the application of the death penalty. David Leroy Washington, State, Florida. David Leroy Washington was executed for a series of murders committed over a 10-day period in 1976. His crime spree began on September 20th, when he and an accomplice killed Pastor Daniel Pridgeon. While the accomplice distracted the victim, Washington fatally stabbed him. 3 days later, on September 23rd, they murdered Katrina Burke, who was known as a drug dealer, and severely wounded other occupants in her house. Then, on September 27th, Washington lured Frank Melly under the pretense of completing a car sale. He tied Melly to a bed for 2 days and on September 29th stabbed him 11 times, burying his body in the backyard. Washington was arrested, confessed to the murders, and was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. His case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which used it to set precedents regarding the quality of legal counsel for indigent inmates. He was executed in the electric chair on June 13, 1984, at the Florida State Prison at the age of 34. In his final statement, he expressed regret. "I regret all the pain I have caused. If my death brings any relief, so be it." He was the 22nd prisoner executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Ernest John Daubert, Jr., State, Florida. Ernest John Daubert, Jr., 46 years old, was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of his 9-year-old daughter, Kelly Ann, and second-degree murder for the death of his 7-year-old son, Ryder Scott. Kelly's murder occurred on December 31st, 1971, and Ryder's in 1972. Although the bodies were never found, evidence revealed a history of extreme abuse. Both children were beaten, strangled, and subjected to torture. Daubert was also convicted of torturing his 11-year-old son, Ernest John Daubert III, and abusing his 5-year-old daughter, Anna Ray. He was arrested in Duval County, Florida, and convicted in 1974. The jury recommended a sentence of life imprisonment by majority, but the judge overturned this recommendation, citing the brutality of the crimes, and sentenced him to death. During his execution, Daubert made no final statement. He shook his shaved head and calmly said, "No, no," in front of a microphone held by the prison superintendent, Richard Duggar. Just before receiving the electric shock, he winked at his pastor, Reverend Melvin Biggs. He was executed in the electric chair on September 7, 1984, at the Florida State Prison. Daubert was the 8th man to be executed in Florida after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976 and the 23rd nationally. In his final days, he had an emotional reconciliation with his surviving daughter, Anna Ray. Timothy George Baldwin, State, Louisiana. Timothy George Baldwin was convicted for the murder of 85-year-old Mary James Peters, a blind woman and his former neighbor, as well as the godmother of his youngest son. The crime occurred on April 4, 1978, in West Monroe, Louisiana, during a home robbery. Peters was brutally beaten with a frying pan, a stool, a telephone, and a small television. Baldwin was executed in the electric chair on September 10, 1984. James Dupree Henry, State, Florida. On March 23, 1974, in Orlando, during a robbery, James Dupree Henry broke into the home of Zellie Riley, an 81-year-old civil rights leader. He bound, gagged, and slashed Riley's throat with a knife. He then brutally beat him with his fists and a pistol, stealing several valuables and $64 in cash. The following day, Riley failed to appear at church, prompting his family to alert the authorities. The police discovered his body after conducting a welfare check. Henry's fingerprints found at the crime scene directly linked him to the murder. 5 days later, Detective Ronald E. Ferguson approached Henry for questioning. Henry attacked him, stole his gun, and shot him in the chest and abdomen. Ferguson managed to survive the attack. In June 1974, Henry was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His execution was initially scheduled for December 1979, but it was postponed. The execution sparked significant controversy. Civil rights leaders, including Jesse Jackson and Coretta Scott King, called for clemency, arguing that the conviction was racially motivated. William Riley, the victim's son, also opposed the execution, stating that his father loved peace and despised revenge. However, Governor Bob Graham upheld the execution order. On September 20, 1984, James Dupree Henry was executed by electrocution in Florida. His last meal consisted of a dozen oysters with hot sauce and crackers. When asked if he had any last words, he declared, "My last words are, I am innocent." He was declared dead at 7 a.m. His case remains one of the most controversial in the history of the death penalty in Florida. Linwood Earl Briley, State, Virginia. Linwood Earl Briley, along with his brothers James Dyro, J.B. Briley Jr., and Anthony Ray Briley, formed a trio of serial killers responsible for a violent crime spree in Richmond, Virginia, in 1979. Linwood had already committed a murder in 1971, for which he spent a year in a juvenile detention center. In 1979, the three brothers, with the help of Duncan Eric Meekins, unleashed a massacre that resulted in at least 11 deaths, with 2 people managing to escape. Linwood and J.B. were sentenced to death. During the trial, Meekins agreed to cooperate with authorities and provided details of the crimes in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 80 years under an alias in a facility outside the state. Anthony Briley was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, as his involvement was considered lesser. Linwood was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of Mary Gowan Gallagher. In 1984, Linwood and J.B. led a daring escape from death row at the Mecklenburg Correctional Center, along with 4 other inmates. During the escape, they planned to kill the guards with isopropyl alcohol, but other inmates intervened to prevent it. They also attempted to sexually assault a nurse, but were stopped by another prisoner. After 3 weeks on the run, both were recaptured. Linwood was executed by electrocution on October 12, 1984. His last meal included filet mignon, baked potato, peas, salad, rolls, cake, peaches, punch, and milk. His final words before being executed were, "I am innocent." Ernest Knighton, Jr., State, Louisiana. Ernest Knighton, Jr. was convicted of the murder of Ralph Schell, a 52-year-old gas station owner in Bosser City, Louisiana. The crime occurred on March 17, 1981, during a robbery attempt. Knighton shot Schell, killing him on the spot. During the trial, Knighton acknowledged his guilt and expressed remorse. He was sentenced to death and was incarcerated at the Angola State Penitentiary. On October 30, 1984, he was executed by electrocution at the age of 38. Before his execution, he had studied images of the electric chair to gather the courage for the ordeal. His last meal consisted of a T-bone steak, rice, French fries, 4 slices of toasted bread, and a strawberry milkshake. His final words were, "I am sorry, more than I can express. Mr. Schell is dead, and I am responsible. I am sorry for Mrs. Schell and for all of her family and friends. I am sorry for my mother, my family, and everyone who will mourn my loss. I have asked God to forgive me. I must say that what you do is wrong. If I thought that my death would bring Mr. Shell back or save someone from murder, I would offer myself, but I know that it will not. Killing does not teach respect for life. I urge you not to kill anyone else. I ask God to forgive you for killing me. Now I ask God, in the name of Jesus, to receive my spirit. Thomas Andrew Barefoot, State, Texas. On August 7, 1978, Harker Heights police officer Carl Levin, 31, was shot in the head while attempting to stop a suspect for arson. The assailant fled the scene but was arrested 2 days later at a bus station in Houston, Texas. He was carrying a .25 caliber pistol and was identified as Thomas Andrew Barefoot, a 37-year-old fugitive from Louisiana, wanted in New Mexico for the rape of a 3-year-old girl. Barefoot had an extensive criminal record, including charges for aggravated assault, hit and run, sexual abuse, attempted rape, armed robbery, and drug and weapon-related offenses. 2 former roommates testified that Barefoot had expressed his intention to kill a Harker Heights police officer as revenge for a previous arrest, although Levin was not his original target. In November 1978, after a 3-day trial, Barefoot was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, he was allowed to speak with family members, receive visitors, smoke cigarettes, and eat his favorite meal: soup with crackers, chili with beans, steamed rice, seasoned mustard greens, spicy beets, and iced tea. His final statement was, "I hope that someday we can remember the evil we are doing right now, like the witches we burned at the stake. I want everyone to know that I hold no grudges. I forgive everyone. I hope that all of those I've wronged will forgive me. I've been praying all day that Carl Levin's wife will be free from the bitterness in her heart, because that bitterness she carries within her will send her to hell as surely as any other sin. I regret everything I've done to you. I hope you forgive me. Sharon, say goodbye to all my friends. You know who they are: Charles Bass, David Powell." He was executed by lethal injection on October 30th, 1984, 7 minutes after the execution of Ernest Knighton Jr. in Louisiana. Velma Barfield, State, North Carolina. In the 1970s, Velma Barfield caused the death of her boyfriend, Roland Stewart Taylor, by poisoning him with arsenic in his tea and beer. However, investigations revealed that her story was much darker, as she was also implicated in the death of her ex-husband, Jennings Barfield, in 1970. In 1976, Velma began working as a caregiver at a nursing home, where she was involved in several suspicious deaths of the people she cared for. Among them were her mother, Lillian Bullard, who died suddenly in 1974, and Dolly Edwards and her husband Montgomery Edwards, who both died under suspicious circumstances in 1977. It was at this nursing home where suspicions about Velma began, as it was discovered that she had been involved in the deaths of Dolly and Montgomery Edwards. When the body of her ex-husband, Jennings Barfield, was exhumed, it was also found to contain arsenic. This eventually led to her arrest. During Velma's trial, she was only judged and convicted for the death of Roland Stewart Taylor. She was sentenced to death and held in a North Carolina prison, where she became the only woman on death row at that time. On November 2, 1984, hours before her execution, she requested as her last meal a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. During her final moments, dressed in pink pajamas and an adult diaper, her last words were, "I know everyone has gone through a lot of pain. All the families are connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everyone who has supported me through all of these 6 years." After receiving the lethal injection, doctors confirmed her death hours later. Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Timothy Palms. State, Florida. Timothy Palms was convicted for the murder of James N. Stone, the owner of a furniture store in Jacksonville, Florida. On October 4, 1976, Palms and his accomplice, Ronald Straight, lured Stone to the apartment of his secretary. There, they struck him with a hammer, tied his hands and feet with wire, and locked him in a wooden box that had been specifically built for this purpose. For approximately 30 minutes, the victim was brutally beaten, tortured, and mutilated. His fingers were amputated as he begged for his life. Finally, they stabbed him 18 times with a butcher knife and a machete. The box containing his body was then thrown into the St. Johns River. The motive behind the crime was robbery. They stole Stone's money, watch, and car, while Stone's secretary, Jane Allen, stole $2,800 from the store. Palms and Straight fled the state but were eventually captured in California. Palms confessed to the crime, and the coffin was recovered from the river. Both were tried separately, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to death. A third accomplice, Albert, received immunity in exchange for testifying against the others. Timothy Palms was executed in the electric chair on November 8, 1984, at 10:03 a.m. in Stark, Florida. He was 33 years old. His last words were, "The love of my family has been my strength. That's all." Goodbye. Alpha Otis O'Daniel Stevens. State, Georgia. Alpha Otis O'Daniel Stevens was convicted of the murder of Roy Asbel, which occurred on August 21, 1974, in Twiggs County, Georgia. At the time, Stevens had escaped from the Houston County Jail, where he was serving a life sentence for another murder. During his escape, Stevens broke into the house of Charles Asbel, allegedly accompanied by another man. While looting the house and loading several weapons, including a Magnum .357 revolver, into a 1972 Dodge, Roy Asbel, father of the homeowner, arrived in his vehicle. Stevens later stated that Asbel became alarmed upon seeing the rifles in the car and drew his own weapon. At that moment, Stevens shot and killed him. Stevens was found guilty of murder at the Bleckley County Superior Court on January 20th and 21st, 1975. After exhausting all appeals, he was executed in the electric chair in the early morning of December 15, 1984, in Georgia. He was 39 years old. The execution became notorious due to a procedural error. The first electric shock, which lasted for 2 minutes and was administered at 12:18 a.m., failed to kill him. His chest continued to rise and fall, and he breathed 23 times during the 6 minutes of waiting before the medical team could examine him. At 12:24 a.m., a second shock lasting 2 minutes was applied. Stevens was declared dead at 12:37 a.m. The prison officials were unable to explain what went wrong. It was the 20th execution in the United States in 1984, and the third in Georgia that year. Robert Lee Willie. State, Louisiana. Robert Lee Willie was a serial killer who confessed to 5 murders in Louisiana between 1978 and 1980. He was sentenced to death for the rape and murder of 18-year-old Faith Hathaway, a crime he committed alongside his accomplice Joseph Jesse Vaccaro. They were also involved in the kidnapping and abuse of Debbie Cuevas, as well as the attempted murder of Mark Brewster, who survived but was left with lasting injuries. Willie also had a prior conviction for the murder of Dennis Hemby in 1978. While on death row, he received spiritual guidance from Sister Helen Prejean, who later wrote about their relationship in the book Dead Man Walking. Willie was executed on December 28, 1984, 5 days before his 27th birthday. His execution was the 6th in Louisiana within a span of 13 months. For his last meal, he chose fried fish, oysters, shrimp, French fries, and salad. His execution was witnessed by his family, Sister Prejean, and the parents of Faith Hathaway. Before dying, Willie made his final statement. "I hope my death gives you some relief. Killing people is wrong. That's why I've been sentenced to death. It doesn't matter if it's citizens, countries, or governments. Killing is wrong." He then winked and remained silent. Sister Prejean, who was with him until the end, stated that the wink was a gesture of peace. However, others interpreted it as an act of defiance.